So my name's John Field, Director of Operations at Keystone Fire Safety. At Keystone, we provide passive fire protection, we provide servicing, maintenance and installation of fire doors. We also provide fire strategies and fire risk assessments, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. So first things first, before I do engage and start the conversation, once upon a time, when I was a fire safety inspecting officer with Bedfordshire Fire and Rescue Service, we pondered a question. Is a fire risk assessment the foundation of any fire safety or general fire precautions within a building, within an organisation, or is it the icing on top? Which one is it? I'll let you ponder that question and I'll let you answer it at the end at your leisure. But now we'll get into the presentation. Okay, so why do we need fire risk assessments? Well, it's actually written in law, in regulations, in orders. So we've got the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulation. Regulation 3 requires that you carry out a fire risk assessment if you're an employer to protect your employees. The Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, Article 9, requires that you carry out a fire risk assessment to assess the risks within your building, and you put measures in place to reduce those risks, protecting your employees. And under the DSEAR regulations, Regulation 5 is very, very specific in what it requires, but once again, it requires you to carry out a risk assessment. So when completing a risk assessment, what you need to do is several different aspects. And we have here, you have to identify the fire and or explosion hazard. Obviously, if it's health and safety, you don't necessarily need to consider those. You need to consider what is it that could cause a slip, trip and fall, etc., etc. So you have to identify these hazards in the first place. You have to consider who might be at risk, okay? So that's all the relevant people. So that could be employees, that could be contractors, so people who are self-employed within your place of work, you still have a responsibility for them. It could be people that are actually walking by, it could be members of the public. Now, interestingly enough, under health and safety, you have to consider the risk to any relevant person. So if someone breaks into your premises at night and comes to harm, then you could be responsible for that aspect of them coming to harm. The Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order only requires you to carry out a risk assessment and to consider the people who are lawfully on the premises and those that aren't firefighters. So you don't have to consider the risk to firefighters in the event of a fire on your premises, and it's only those that are lawfully on the premises. You have to consider the most probable occurrence and most likely severity. So what is it that could cause a fire, and perhaps how serious might that fire be? And you'll come up with a matrix, so your qualitative and quantitative results, and you'll consider them, and you'll consider on your matrix how likely is a fire going to occur and how severe will that fire be. And we'll go into a bit more detail as to what sort of things we'll be looking at with regards to a fire risk assessment and a DSEAR risk assessment a bit later on. But you have to consider all those aspects. And then you have to control the risk. You have to reduce the risk to as low as reasonably practicable. And in order to do that, we have the hierarchy of controls. Some people may have seen it, some people may not have seen this in their entire lives. So ultimately, at the very top, normally you see people in high vises, you see people in gloves, you see people in hard hats. That's the thing at the bottom. That's the last thing you should consider when it comes to removing that hazard or reducing the risk to people. So the first thing you should consider is eliminating that risk at source, not introducing that risk into your workplace in the first instance. If that's not possible, if you still have to consider, my apologies, I'm just going to do my time. If you still have to consider what risk, I still have to introduce this activity, then what you should do is actually look at replacing what it is that you've got that might be harmful for something that's less harmful. Then you should consider maybe engineering controls. So it might be putting barriers in the way to stop people from being able to enter a certain space and come into harm. Then you should consider administrative controls. So that might be putting notices and signs up to warn people. So you might have a wet floor sign, although you've still got a hazard because the floor's still wet, but you're actually warning people, that floor's wet, be cautious, be careful. And then, as I said, the PPE being the last thing. But what you should consider is the PPE for all rather than individuals. So it might be that you have a full arrest system that everyone's connected to, rather than an individual wearing a specific item that it's just purely for them, and then you have to remember that each person has to have those items on them. Once you've done that, you then have to record those findings, and generally it's the significant findings that you should be looking at recording. What is it that's most important that I need to take note of, that I need to address? And then obviously, like everything, you need to review it. It might be that nothing's changed. Well, I've reviewed it, I've seen nothing's changed, actually that's fine, what stands still stands. It might be that there's been a process change, it might be an introduction of a new piece of equipment. It might be we've changed the way that we're actually going to work on this piece of equipment. Therefore, you need to review the risk assessment and you need to update it accordingly to make sure that it's appropriate for what you're actually doing. And as I've just gone through, there are 5 steps to the risk assessment, as I've just detailed. And it does depend on ultimately what you're doing and the purpose of the risk assessment as to what risks are going to be identified. It might mean that you need specialist assistance. If you don't necessarily have the knowledge to actually identify a particular risk because you're not familiar with a particular process, or it's something that actually this is outside my skill set, you may well need to get a specialist in who can deal with that sort of aspect. DSEAR, for example, is quite a specialist skill to know how to identify the flammable substances or corrosive substances. But this is available in the guide, which I'll show you a bit later on. So then we look at specifics that are in a fire risk assessment. Really, these are taken from the PAS 79 model, which is a publicly accessible standard that everyone can access and use. But ultimately, what you're trying to do is identify the premises, because a sleeping accommodation brings different risk to somewhere like this big hall. Here, everybody's awake, everybody's aware of their surroundings. We might not be totally familiar with our surroundings, but if you're asleep, like I was last night in the Holiday Inn, it's quite warm in the room, but that's fine. A bottle of wine didn't do any problems there. But ultimately, if I'm asleep, I'm not really familiar with the building, that introduces different risks if someone wakes me up at 3 in the morning with a fire alarm activating. We should also consider, well, does anyone have any mobility issues or impairments, perhaps? And there'll be a discussion on that later on today by my colleague Steve. But that then introduces situations. Do these people need assistance should an evacuation be necessary? What particular hazards are there that could actually burn? And what particular elements are there that could actually catch fire? In essence, you're looking at the triangle of fire. How do you prevent these things from happening? What you should consider as well, what type of heating system do we have? Many a time you'll see it, you see the old gas burner next to the reception area, so you'll be sat there keeping nice and warm, but you've got this naked gas flame next to this material. You could get spontaneous combustion, it could cause a fire spread, there could be issues there. Or is it maybe a radiator, which doesn't have any elements of electricity to it. It doesn't have any elements of flame. Electrical, as it had the 5-year fixed wire testing. Has the appliances been tested, portable appliance testing? Has it had a visual check? The lighting, well, that could go up because all wiring, all electricity has its risk because it's constantly got heat going through it and it has a combustible material surrounding it. Smoking. Do people smoke on the premises? The amount of times I see no smoking on the premises, smoking is done off-site. Okay, so what you're actually doing is taking that fire risk to someone else's property where people might drop their cigarette in a bush and it might catch fire, etc. So what you'd be looking at is appropriate facilities for people to smoke on your premises so it's actually controlled in a controlled condition. Arson, is there any risk from arson? So it might be that you're looking for cameras, you're looking for security doors. Is there any access round the back that people can sneak in and maybe set light to the premises? Now, believe it or not, when you're considering fire safety, you have to consider arson, but ultimately you only plan for one seat of fire at one time. Arsonists will quite often set a couple of seats of fire, but you don't have to plan for that, but you still have to try and protect the premises from arson. Cooking, is there cooking on the premises? A tea point with an urn, a tea urn, that is not a fire risk. That's just a normal electrical hazard, okay? That doesn't need to be in a fire-resisting room. If you've got a hob, if you've got a cooker, there might be different activities with regards to cooking within that area. Well, ultimately, that will need to be in a fire-resisting room because there is a risk there that a greater risk from a fire occurring. Contractors, they don't necessarily spontaneously combust, but what they might be doing is actually carrying out hot works. So you must consider, well, what is it they're doing? Can they cause a fire in their activity? It could be hot works. Do we need to start issuing permits and so on? Smoking, we've already done smoking, so I won't go on to that, and we've already done arson. So when we're looking at the content of the fire risk assessment, we're also looking at what actual measures are already in place. So it could be the means of escape. Is it suitable, sufficient? Is the travel distance long enough? I'll be talking about accreditation with regards to fire doors a bit later on. Well, the consider is, does it need to be a fire door? If the travel distances are within the recognised and recommended distance, then you don't really need that protected area. It does depend on what's going on, obviously, within the space. You want to limit the fire spread, so you want to contain it in one area because generally there is a sort of lots of facts and figures. If a small business has a fire and they don't start up within the year, the chances are they'll go bust and they won't start up ever again. Has it got emergency escape lighting? Can people escape in the event of a fire and the event of a power failure? But what if the emergency lighting fails? What then? Has it got sufficient signs and notices? I always love this one. Has it got a fire action plan? Well, how many of you, have the fire alarm gone off, you've then stopped to read the fire action plan? Well, actually, what is it that I need to do right now? Generally, people don't necessarily read the fire action plan as they're hitting the manual call point or as they're leaving the building. Generally, it should be when you're signing in, you'll sign in to say you've read the fire action plan and you agree and you will comply. Has it got alarms and detections? So we're kind of going through the regulatory reform fire safety order here. Article 13, fire alarms, firefighting equipment. Article 14, means of escape. Is there sufficient extinguishers? We frown upon hose reels now because it gives you a continuous supply and you can drag the hose, it wedges doors open, etc., etc. Nowadays, we really only like one use of one extinguisher. If you haven't put it out by then get out. Get the fire brigade out in the first place. So they're managing the situation. Have you got a fire strategy written up on how to deal with these sort of things? Have you got policies and procedures in place that identify specific roles and responsibilities for key people? Have you got plans for the event of a fire? Is there a procedure? Who's involved? It might be that you have to allocate fire wardens. Have you got forms in place? So it might be that you have to check people in and check people out. It might be that you have to go and do your daily, your weekly, your monthly, your 6 monthly checks. So you're actually ticking the boxes to say that you've carried them out. Practice, muscle memory. Every year, everyone has to go through and have a fire drill. The more you train and practice these things, the more people will remember what to do in the event of emergency. You will be surprised how people behave. I used to work at Imperial College London, very intelligent people. It all went a bit awry when all of a sudden what they were working on started to combust. They all would just leave it and walk and go and find their teacher. Forget about the fact that it could burn the building down. I'm not dissing Imperial, by the way, top class university. Make sure you're keeping the records. Young people, inherently, they haven't got the experience, the life experience to know about safety as much as more mature people, perhaps like myself. So they have to have specific risk assessments written for them, and they have to be kept an eye on, bless them. And then vulnerable adults. I have mentioned that about perhaps people with impairments, or perhaps people who their cognitive abilities aren't quite that of a normal adult. They will need to support in. Some people, if the fire alarm activates, that can cause distress. So you need to be aware of all these things beforehand. So the government guides, the government have produced lots and lots and lots of different guides. They're all different colours, and they are free on the government website. You can always talk to institutions like us. We've got our LinkedIn page, and we put lots of information on there. So join us on LinkedIn. You can go on the IOSH website and find out information. You can obviously be a member, and then we'll share information with our members. It could be that you contact the manufacturer. And again, I can talk about that a bit later when I'm talking about accreditation for installation of fire safety measures. Trade associations, you can talk to these traders and ask them specific questions about the regulations, the laws, what is it that I'm meant to be doing. The British Standards Institute, you can pay them wads of cash and get a British standard, which within a couple of years will be out of date anyway, but it's all good. I'm sure you could borrow it off someone perhaps. You've got the Fire Rescue Service. Never be afraid to ask the Fire and Rescue Service, the Fire Safety Department. Having been a firefighter, I had very little knowledge about fire safety. I then went into the Fire Safety Department and I had a broader range of knowledge. A lot of firefighters would maybe consider they have more knowledge than they perhaps have been trained to do, but go and speak to the Fire Safety Department and they will help you no end. As a business, they would rather you approach them and solved any problems before they became an issue. And then obviously there's internet searches, but be very careful when carrying out internet searches, because sometimes people interpret information, they put it on their web page, and it might not totally be correct, or it might be out of date, because the way the legislation has gone recently, it is going out of date very quickly. So supporting a fire risk assessment. So when carrying out a risk assessment, ultimately, you've got to have a lot of ability, you've got to have a lot of skill. In a simple complex, in a simple premises, it might be a small office or something, it can be pretty obvious what the risks are and what you're looking at and how to control those risks. In a more complex premises, there might be certain fire safety measures that you might be not fully aware of. Okay, you might not have attended certain courses on sprinklers, for example, so you might not know where they have to be introduced and how they have to be introduced. You've got to make sure that you stay on top of the game and be aware of any changes in the legislation, the regulations. There's been lots of change recently as a result of Grenfell, so you've got to make sure that you're aware of all these different changes. For example, if you've got a building over 11 metres and it's newly built now, you have to have wayfinding signage. If it was built before approximately 2022, then it's 18 metres and above, you have to have wayfinding signage. Well, hang on, that's the difference. But it can help and save you money if you know these differences. It can help if you join a professional group, such as the IOSH Fire Risk Management Group, maintain CPD, so attend events and free events like this, and come and listen to people talk, like me. Keep your competencies up to date. So when I started at Imperial, I'd been working in fire safety, I'd attended a fire risk assessment course. A couple of years later, I attended another one with a different service provider, just to keep my hand in case there was a new way of thinking about things. You can always, it's always key that you keep an eye on what is that you've identified, and the people that are identified as having to rectify these problems. Basically keep an eye and track that they are carrying out those activities. So ultimately, PAS 79 is very helpful. At the very end, Appendix A, I believe it is, it gives you that tick box and those boxes where you can actually fill out information and detail. DSEAR is slightly different because you have to consider the flammable substances, and there was a change not that long ago where you have to also consider corrosive substances as well. If you've got any exposed steels and these substances could harm those steels that are holding the building up, then ultimately you've got to consider those as well within your DSEAR risk assessment. And my colleagues have been saying DSEAR risk, no, it's DSEAR, okay? Let's not go down that route. So ultimately what you need to do is make sure there's a limited number of personnel involved. Generally, when you're doing your occupancy factors, when you're doing experiments, you need quite a large area in comparison to you guys that are sat down there today, right now. You only need a small area in which to be sat. In a lab, you have to give people more room, so inherently you will have less people in the lab. Try and control the experiment that you're doing. Maybe if you're decanting from a large container into a small container, a flammable substance, then ultimately do it in a fume hood. Keep plug sockets quite high, so if any vapours do gather on the ground, they can't affect any of the sockets. There's all these different considerations. And then should there be vapours gathered, then you have to start zoning the area. And it could be very close to where these fumes could gather. You have to use certain pieces of equipment that are protected and are intrinsically safe. So that means they're protected from the environment. So if there's any sparks or electrical element that might happen, it's confined within the actual item itself. And so you can see there are similarities as I've gone through. It's all about identifying the hazard, identifying the people that might come to harm, identifying measures that you can put in place to solve those issues, and then obviously constantly reviewing the risk assessment itself. My apologies that was quite a steam through and I didn't necessarily talk about every aspect. However, do we have any questions? If you do, go and ask Vicky over there. No, do we have any questions? Yes.
Hold on. Let me, hold on, sir. There we go. Speak to Mike, we can all hear you nice.
When I go to client sites, I often see clients creating their own risk assessment via established checklist. And I kind of want to move away from that, and I kind of say that's not something that, it's not very robust. Am I right in saying that? I mean, should they, it's more like a yes, no, have you got this? Is it?
Indeed. Ultimately, you might have a question, are there fire extinguishers? Yes. Yeah. Well, okay. It might say, are they suitable and sufficient? Yes. It's always good to quantify these aspects. I've likened it to whenever you're in a court of law, the judge will ask you, okay, you've said it's got fire extinguishers, you said they're suitable, sufficient. What fire extinguishers were they? How many were they? Where were they positioned and situated? How do you know they were suitable and sufficient?
Yeah.
So generally there should be comment boxes for you to justify that aspect. And there could be an aspect where, for example, the travel distance is over 18 metres, single travel, it could be 25 metres. Well, that might not be a problem if you can justify other aspects. If you're just ticking the box, yes, it's all suitable, sufficient, that really isn't justifying it. It might be, actually, instead, you know, is there a fire alarm system and does it work? Yes. Well, it might be, instead of perhaps being an L4 system where it's just on the common parts, as it were, it could be an L1 system, so it's everywhere. Well, actually, a fire will be discovered quite early, so you might get away with an extended travel day. So if you could put that commentary, then ultimately that will allow you and help you justify your factors. And when you're in a court of law, that will help you remember what it is, you know, how you come to that conclusion. So I would concur with your response there.
I mean,
definitely.
they're usually about 2 or 3 pages, and when I do my fire risk assessments, well, it's very robust, you know, very thorough.
Yes, definitely.
So,
you're showing your knowledge and your skills by being able to put a commentary as to justifying, yes, you know, they're within the recognised parameters. So I've got a water there within 30 metres of the other water. You're showing that you've got that knowledge. And also when the fire service turn up, if they are reading a 3-page document that's yes, no, tick box, they might then start to question, and they'll ask the person questions. If it's all justified and commented and statemented within that fire risk assessment, and it's reasonably thick, if they've read it before they've turned up, they'll more often than not be satisfied more so. They'll just check, well, is that in place? Yeah, okay, I'm going to leave you alone.
Good.
Most definitely.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, if you could pass that to the gentleman next to you.
What it is with the DSEAR fire risk assessment, can you link that with a normal fire risk assessment?
Okay, so a DSEAR risk assessment is slightly different, but you are considering fire. And one element of the fire risk assessment will ask you about hazardous substances. Article 15 and 16, you know, how have you prepared for a hazardous substance, as it were, or hazardous activity, and then Article 16, you're talking about you know, those sort of substances and elements, and so the answer would be a DSEAR risk assessment should be carried out or has been carried out. So they are interlinked in that respect, and what you're looking at when you're carrying out a DSEAR risk assessment is what is the risk of fire, how are we eliminating that risk of fire. So they are sort of combined, but then separate, they do cover those aspects themselves anyway. So yes, most definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any more questions? Oh, thank you, sir.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Is with the Grenfell inquiry coming out and a spotlight turning on to fire safety and building management, is there any appetite or indication within the industry that we're going to head towards a duty holder matrix set up in alignment with the sort of thing that we see in water management? Because obviously fire safety management is a holistic approach to managing a building, as in the same aspect with water. Is there any indications from the industry that we're going to be going down that route?
In the duty holder aspect, do you mean
So
someone
who is ultimately responsible? Who is appointed? Who are your competent persons for delivering this fire safety management and practical controls that are applied to it?
At this moment in time, you have the responsible person anyway. They have to be identified. Normally, that's a company or an organisation, unless it's a single person. You have the responsible person. Article 5.3 will apportion those roles of the responsible person on someone that has a control of a building. You have your, with the Building Safety Act, that introduced other people, so the legislation is kind of there, and it's gone even more so into the, with the Building Safety Act being introduced, it is defining specific roles and responsibilities. Ultimately, what used to happen, as a fire safety inspecting officer, it was so hard to prosecute people because you didn't really have to live in the country or be identified. Now with the Building Safety Act, you have to have details of the person with a UK address, basically their details of the person that owns the property and so on and so forth. So it is going down that route of more accountability, and the government have produced guidance on specifically the roles of a responsible person. So we are pretty much there anyway, but maybe there's a bit more to do.
Thank you.
Definitely, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Hi, is there a minimum competency level to carry out a DSEAR risk assessment?
So at the moment, it's all up in the air with regards to competency of fire risk assessment and DSEAR. Within the fire safety order, it just simply says, with regards to fire risk assessments, that the person has to be competent. People would look at competency, well, it's training, it's skills, it's knowledge, how many years you've been doing an activity. Ultimately, it has to really lie with the person that is carrying out the assessment as to being open and honest enough to identify whether they feel they have that skill set or not. We are going down the route. There's consultation at the moment with regards to competency of fire risk assessors, and a PAS has been produced with regards to that aspect. But at the moment, it's down to that individual. Do they feel competent or not? So although the emphasis or impetus is on the person that's employing someone to carry that out to make sure they're competent, if that person carrying it out can't say they're competent or not, then it does make it harder. But I'm sure with everything, especially with fire risk assessors that are going through this process, I'm sure it won't be long before that happens with DSEAR, most definitely.
Lady at the back, John.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
Just to follow on from that, have you got any recommendations on DSEAR competence and where we get training, etc.? Because that's going to be potentially part of my role. So,
most definitely. So the HSE do provide qualifications in DSEAR. It is one of those where that was you, not me.
It was.
It is one of those where. So I would be on a fire risk assessor course. A certain organisation would say, we can save some money because we're paying this company lots of money to get them in to do the fire risk assessments. We could do it in-house. Well, if you've just attended a course, that doesn't necessarily make you competent or capable of fulfilling those roles. So I would suggest the HSE or one prime organisation. I believe the Fire Service College might have offered those sort of courses. But you might want to consider going online, looking for organisations that perhaps carry out DSEAR risk assessments, and then shadowing, or going online and seeing if you can observe DSEAR risk assessments that have been already written. There is a danger that they might not be suitable sufficient, but really it's get your qualifications, shadow people, gain that experience, and as you face new situations that you have to find a solution for, then you'll learn far more and you'll develop and become sort of a whole person, as it were. But there's always something new to learn.